All right. I think we can get started. People are still joining, but I'll go ahead and get the introduction underway. So good afternoon. Welcome to today's webinar on the construction painter's exposure to chemical mixtures, health implications, and opportunities for disease prevention. I'm Chris Kane, CPWR's Executive Director, and I'll be moderating today's webinar. I'm happy to have the research team from the University of Massachusetts Lowell here with me today to talk about their ongoing research into chemical exposures. As most of you know, this is a project funded under our NIOSH grant. And now it's my pleasure to introduce today's panelist. Dr. Dhimiter Bello is a professor at the University of Massachusetts Lowell, and Dr. Annie Bello is a research associate professor at the University of Massachusetts Lowell. With that, I will go ahead and turn it over to you and be back with at the question and answer time. Thank you. Welcome. You're on mute, Dhimiter.
Of course. Thank you, Chris. Good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to thank you for taking time out of your busy schedules to be present for this webinar. It's a great pleasure to be here and share some of our ongoing research with chemical exposures in construction, which is a topic of particular interest to our research team. Before I move on to the actual content of the webinar, I would like to start by acknowledging that this has been work that has developed over a number of years. Almost a decade is the origin of some of the ideas that we have been working on. And a number of doctoral students and other research professionals have contributed towards the development of ideas into products and some proposals. In particular, Ani and Faridi, Kushal, Yalong Su, Lucia Chanetza, Mike Pellet, all of these guys have gotten their PhDs or are getting their PhDs in different disciplines, but focusing on chemical exposures and chemical toxicology in construction spaces. And we are grateful for the opportunity to engage in this kind of research. Now, before the presentation, a quick overview of the presentation, I would like to focus on largely industrial steel structure coatings today, the motivation for this work, and the drive to document and prioritize chemicals of concerns and various health endpoints for analytical method development, for biomonitoring, and for disease prevention efforts, with some emphasis on amine hardeners and epoxy systems. And I would like to spend most of the time towards sharing some urinary biomonitoring data on industrial painters, metals, PFAS, and effect biomarkers in the class of oxidative stress markers in urine, kidney injury markers, and the growing interest on using chemical biomarkers for heat stress. Some of the data that we'll present are curated and published, and we will reference the audience to those publications for more details. Some data have been completely analyzed, but are in the process of being curated, and the context of biological significance is under development. We chose to present some of those data in hope that they will serve as conversation starters for this community of people, and also to accelerate development of research methods and biomonitoring needs, whereas some other ideas are more in lines of where do we go as a community next, and again intended to get some conversations started. We'd like to leave some time for questions, and in order to do that, I would go quickly through some of the slides. So please post any questions or requests you have in the chat, and we'll follow with you at a later time. So the focus largely over the past decade has been on reactive chemical systems based on isocyanates and epoxies and industrial painters. We also have done quite a bit of work with spray polyurethane foam installations. And these two cohorts we are analyzing in parallel, sometimes comparing and contrasting with each other to provide some context. And because they share to some extent similarities in the chemistries of isocyanate formulations. Part A, isocyanate and epoxy resins themselves. We have published quite a bit in the past a few years. We believe we understand those systems much better than Part B, which are both complex and complex mixtures. And hence the focus here will be on Part B. The motivation for why we are zooming in on industrial painters, and it was driven largely by some of our earlier field observations. Industrial painters as a profession was classified by IARC as a group 1 non-human carcinogen as early as 1989 based on back then mesothelioma risk, and then reconfirmed again in around 2010 based on increased risks of lung and urinary bladder cancers. It was well documented in those papers that exposures are complex, a long list of potential agents causing cancer, but agents responsible for some of these effects only partially understood and poorly documented. Other major concerns that have emerged with this group of workers in construction: allergic contact dermatitis, which, as we understand, has continued to be a major challenge in some of the European countries. We have heard that from colleagues as well as industry insurance companies, and respiratory sensitization and asthma. And in the scientific literature, allergic contact dermatitis due to epoxies and amine hardeners used in those formulations have been documented with high quality, I must say, by researchers in the Scandinavian countries in particular. But those have been the sort of the drivers to the framework for some of the work that we will present. To our surprise, we found limited exposure data and limited health effects data for construction painters in the United States, especially in these domains. For those who may not be familiar with two-component systems, it's whether they are based on isocyanates or epoxies, two separate buckets that are mixed before application in the field, following manufacturers' recommendations. They have a particular sort of curing time or application time, and they are used either spraying or a combination of spraying, roll, and brush applications in metal structures. The Part A, it's either an epoxy-based or isocyanate-based. Part B follows, depending on the formulation, amine hardeners, solvents, fillers, particulate, nano, and microscopic scale, other specialty additives, as well as catalysts or accelerators. These are the big classes that go into those two buckets. These are some examples of the structures where coating in metal structures is applied and that we have investigated. Bridges are and big water tanks are a major application. A couple of years ago, we presented a webinar, 2019, actually, on exposures and urinary biomonitoring of aliphatic isocyanates in construction metal structure coatings, where we document exposures and urinary biomonitoring data for isocyanates. And you could find information, if you are interested, by looking at some of these publications. We document there that for the group of workers that we studied, the urinary HDA, a biomarker of aliphatic isocyanate exposures, increased by a factor of 2 to 3 cross shift. And they were elevated in this large number of these workers. Later on in 2021, we presented a second webinar that was focusing specifically on epoxy resins among construction painters, with an emphasis on new and to some extent novel methods for sampling of these reactive aerosols and exposure measurements and urinary biomarkers of epoxy. Two publications, three have been highlighted here. Two of them are important methodological papers where now I think one can look at the literature and adopt both methods and analytical for sampling and analysis of these systems. There we documented that both exposures, potential for dermal exposure, potential for inhalation exposure, and actual exposures as measured by changes in badge biomarkers in urine, which is a marker of epoxies, increased similar to isocyanase somewhere around 2 to 3-fold. Together with these papers, we also published some important studies in the lab where we looked at permeation and penetration of these as applied resin systems through gloves and garments, which have direct practical implication for practitioners and those who try to cut exposures. Over the past 5 years, the focus shifted largely on Part B. And one important question that many of us face with complex mixtures is, where do you put the money? Where do you prioritize to develop targeted methodologies for both analytical methods, for biomonitoring, for exposure monitoring, for disease prevention, and things of this kind? It took us a number of years, and very recently we published a paper that summarizes the outcome of that work for the Northeast protective coating systems that is used in the New England region. A lot of details and documentation and references to some of the data and implications that I will mention can be found in this paper. But I will briefly go through some of the major findings because they provide a framework for the quantitative part of research. And the objective was to document the chemistry of these systems, prioritize target chemicals based on logical endpoints, and then develop methods, analytical methods, to trace exposures and biomarkers of exposure. And in that process, we identified knowledge gaps related to both exposures and the toxicology of these chemicals. So the NEPCOD list for Northeast has actually 4 lists, 2 and 3 code systems with multiple parts, 2 parts and more. And we started with a simple literature review and documentation of material safety data sheets as presented for these systems. And then we catalog the types of chemicals used, the frequency of them, and then expanded to searching the literature for additional scientific literature for exposures, for toxicology, for health effects. And this slide here summarizes the process of sifting through the literature and prioritizing. This is an example of the tedious work that sometimes we have to do to come up with priorities. And from the review of simply the safety data sheets, we documented 42 chemicals in primers, 32 in mid-coat, 51 in top coat, of which 12 amines with unique CAS numbers, 28 solvents with unique CAS numbers, 19 nano and other particulate fillers in the systems, and 4 additives that fell in different categories, including insect repellents. From that list and the literature, then we targeted skin sensitizers as first target. The logic being that potent skin sensitizers do exert their effects at times at somewhat very low concentrations and aligns with continued challenges with allergic and irritant contact dermatitis in some of the construction sectors. We identified 14 skin sensitizers that are listed here. The first 9 are amines. The majority of them are classified as group 1A, and again, for most of them, there is direct animal testing or human patch testing to confirm that they are very potent skin sensitizers. 4 of them fell in the category of solvents down here. While this list of amines is specifically developed for the NEPCODE systems, we understand that similar chemistries, to some extent with their unique differences, are used in other epoxy formulations such as glues, although different amines may be used there. And the number of workers exposed to these reach, at least by one estimate, that we have seen 13 million in the United States and 28,000 bridges undergoing repair in the United States where epoxies are used extensively. So we're talking about a potentially large problem. We also identified 9 carcinogens from this list. They are listed here. 2 of them are group 1 and include crystalline silica, which is used in considerable amounts as a filler in these formulations, and ethanol, and then 7 group 2B carcinogens, one of them being 4-chlorobenzotrifluoride, for which there is interest in understanding their toxicology better. The types of cancer associated with these compounds are listed here: liver and kidney, lung and liver, olfactory system, oral cavities, thyroids, and the like. There are 2 additional amines that have been associated with stomach cancers in a recent large-scale epidemiological study that we reference here. So this list of carcinogens, we believe, is not all-inclusive. However, it forms a good basis for what has been used there. A third point is looking at other potential organ toxicities based on the published toxicological literature on these compounds. And we have a very long table with multiple references to the different chemicals and additives in these formulations. And some common endpoints: neurotoxicity, toxicity of the liver, nephrotoxicity or the kidney, ototoxicity for 3 solvents, reproductive toxicity, genotoxicity, gastrointestinal toxicity, cardiovascular, lung fibrosis, silicosis, COPD, asthma, and some additional endpoints. Now, these are potential endpoints. It doesn't mean that disease will develop. Whether disease develops or not will depend on actual exposures and exposure profiles. For this group of workers, now moving to the second part of sharing some urinary biomonitoring data that and that establishes that, in fact, exposures to these workers, a subgroup of them at least, continue to be elevated, and work practices could and may need to be improved further. We have for this group of workers, we have exposure monitoring data, personal exposure data. We have airborne data. We have personal observations of activities and duration. We have surrogate skin exposure data based on gloves. We have products and product characterization that goes with urinary exposure measurements, urinary specific gravity and creatinine for adjustment purposes, and then mass spectrometry-based analysis of exposure biomarkers, epoxies and isocyanates we've published. We have some new data on metals and PFAS that I will present briefly here. And then oxidative stress markers, it's a panel of 9 markers, kidney injury biomarkers, and 1 heat stress biomarker. Briefly, the number of samples per these groups of workers are down here. We are looking at about 90, close to 100 workers, more or less, each one providing 2 urine samples pre and post shift. From our analysis of the literature, we targeted 10 amines that are used extensively in epoxy formulations in industrial coatings. And there are 2 additional amines we recommend as part of this panel. They are used often in epoxy-based glues and alike. And we have done a similar sort of analysis and targeted method development for amine catalyst in spray polyurethane foams, which for the interest of time, I'm skipping here. In the case of amine catalyst in SPF, we have well-developed and validated methods. And we have presented the data in a poster at the Society of Toxicology meeting. Those interested could drop a note, or we can share the publication with them. We are in the process of writing that paper now, so hopefully the actual method and the data will become available in the near future. For amine catalyst in epoxy systems, what I'm sharing, I consider a first set of data. The methods are turning out to be a little bit more challenging and complex, in part because several of these amines turns out to be mixtures in themselves with 4 or 5 different amine monomers, dimers, and trimers in them that we managed to characterize well. But also some new formulations seem to be unstable in the presence of water and they hydrolyze. And then the issue of isolating them from this very complex mix of other components. And so what I'm presenting here is a straight analysis from them. We have a method that is, I would still consider it preliminary. We need a little bit more investment to make this robust for large scale, but this is an area that we consider it important. And also for biomonitoring purposes, which will take a little longer. But of this 7, for which we have data and screened all of the samples and some products, we found 3 amines detected frequently in gloves. We think we're underestimating here significantly. We have an idea how to improve, but at least these initial data are giving us a stick in the sand, so to speak, or some original values to talk. And the levels here are in the order of nanogram per cubic meter of air, and relatively low, but doesn't meet the other pictures. That's why I think more development is needed here. And happy to engage in additional conversations on that. We did look at metals in urine for the reason that we understand these workers are exposed to a variety of nano and particulate fillers from these formulations, several of them that we documented. But also the first step in coating industrial structures involves abrasive blasting. And so old paints, the breakdown, as well as other elements from abrasive blasting of the steel structure itself could lead to additional exposures. I recognize this is a complex table. It is a conversation starter for us. The biological significance of what this data means is still in the process of developing and comparing with the general population, as well as with some biological exposure indices that exist for them. But I have highlighted some toxic metals here: lead, cadmium, tin, arsenic, manganese, as well as others that are related to fillers like titanium and aluminum. And the general picture is that there appears to be a small group of workers that have likely high elevated levels of these metals. Cross-shift changes in some cases clearly link it with exposures. However, interpretation of urinary metal data is, as you would imagine, not straightforward and a little convoluted, because it depends on the fact on metal solubility, on clearance kinetics, the health status of the kidneys themselves, and other factors. So we are working on this paper. We'll have more clarity on what this data mean in the near future. However, some of the data clearly show that these workers are getting exposed to metals as well, and they are coming. If you compare coating workers to SPF workers or other cohorts, one could clearly see that the levels here in urine are much higher than, let's say, for SPF workers or other like photocopier operators. Some preliminary data on PFAS in this cohort of workers. There's a lot of interest on PFAS nowadays. Limited reports, such as the one from the Healthy Building Network, indicate that PFAS are present in coatings. They use the total fluorine analysis to identify PFAS in these coatings up to 700 ppm, but with no speciation. So we looked at PFAS in some of the products we collected at the sites, and we have an operational mass spec method, triple quadruple, that targets 49 PFASs from C2 to C14, as well as operational untargeted high resolution mass spectrometry analysis that we are doubling down on the analysis. In this 7 coating products that we looked at, we found C4 perfluorobutyl sulfate and sulfonic acid and acetic acid and butyric acid, PFBA, as well as GenX and some PFPRA, which is C3, in several of them at 300 more or less ppm. In urine samples, we found routinely 9 PFASs that we show here. All of them tend to be C2 to C6. And the ones that were in higher concentration were PFPRA, PFPRS, found some GenX, and PFBUA and BUS. But the highest concentrations were for these 3. And frequent, but at relatively low levels of GenX. In untargeted analysis, we have found up to 16 different species, which includes all the 9 PFASs and some newer ones. The level of these short-chain PFASs in the urine of construction workers were close to 100 times higher than what you would expect in the general population. And cross-shift changes in 3 of them were significantly higher than in pre-shift urine, which suggests that they are directly a result of on-the-work exposure, and some of them match the products we find in coatings. Now, we present this data as more of a conversation starter, because we recognize that PFAS in construction is a complex topic, and there are multiple exposure sources, including from lifestyle factors, from foods, from drinking water, from air, and other sources, cosmetic products. And so it is important that when we talk about PFAS and other chemicals, we always emphasize the direct link, whenever possible, with products used at work. And so these cross-shift changes are one part of that evidence. Shifting now to markers of oxidative stress in urine. For those who might not be familiar, oxidative stress is a physiological status where the generation of free radicals, due to a variety of factors, some environmental, some non-environmental, overwhelms the antioxidant system in the system. And with time, the generation of pro-oxidants dominates the health status of the cell. And that generation of free radicals or an oxidative stress environment leads to damage of multiple important biomolecules, including DNA and RNA, which is genetic material, causes enzyme deactivation and protein degradation, which have functional consequences, causes damage of lipids and cellular membranes, and some of those oxidation products lead to additional biological responses in downward cascades. And oxidative stress continues to be implicated in a broad range of diseases and conditions, either as a primary driver of disease or as an enabling additional factor, including in cancer. And so oxidative stress markers such as 8-hydroxydeoxyguanosine or 8-OHDG, 8-hydroxyguanosine, 5-hydroxymethyluracil have been used extensively in occupational research for biomonitoring purposes. And 8-OHDG and 8-OHG in particular are good markers of both oxidative stress and especially 8-OHG of oxidative DNA damage in urine. And there is quite a bit of context that allows us to interpret the biological significance of some of these measures. So we targeted those three. We targeted 3 other markers that reflect amino acid or protein oxidation derived from tyrosine, hydroxytyrosine, 3-nitrotyrosine, and 3-chlorotyrosine, each of them reflecting unique oxidative stress sort of mechanism, generation of free radicals or nitroso products that relates to oxidation of due to nitrogen containing free radicals. And chlorotyrosine is hypochlorous acid, which is related to amyloperoxidase and particles or other compounds in the cell in the process of immune system and cells trying to clear these external stimuli. And then 3 lipid oxidation markers in urine, 8-isoprostane, 4-hydroxynonenal and malondialdehyde. 8-isoprostane and MDA are used extensively in other cohorts, and we have some context. So we're presenting here data only for mid-coat and top coat. And just to make it easier, we have similar data for SPF workers. And 8-OHDG and 8-OHG detected in 100% in relatively elevated levels. We are completing the biological sort of significance comparison and analysis, and we know that there's a subgroup of these workers that have levels of these oxidative stress markers that are significantly higher than what would be normal in the general population and higher than some other cohorts and comparable to levels that we see in welding workers, for example, and some other cohorts. So in all, some of these data establish that there is consequential oxidative stress in these workers, both for DNA markers and for lipids in particular. Then we looked at cross-shift changes of these biomarkers. Again, the idea of looking at cross-shift changes is to establish the extent to which the actual exposures during that shift contribute to changes in the kinetics of clearance of these biomarkers. Again, for biomarkers that have a short clearance half-life in the order of a few hours, you would see a major change over the course of a shift. However, biomarkers that have clearance half-lives in the order of a day or days, that impact of a work shift will likely be seen the next day or the day after. And so sometimes the comparison may point to an opposite direction, and at other times you may not be able to see huge differences. We know, for example, from another published work that for some of these oxidative stress markers, the expression in urine takes from single exposures takes beyond A2AG in particular, beyond 48 hours to reach the peak. So in spite of that, for 4 markers that are indicated with the arrow here, A2HDG, A2HG, 3-nitrotyrosine, and isoprostane, we see statistically significant and increased cross-shift changes in these workers. Again, it doesn't come as a surprise to me at all, considering that exposures are complex, and many of these classes of chemicals do lead to direct generation of free radicals, like several solvents. Particulate matter as well would lead to formation of free radicals and sustained oxidative stress. And it's no surprise at all then that we find these 4 biomarkers at least significantly associated with urinary exposure biomarkers. And this is a partial analysis because we are using for mid-coat, we're using the badge or epoxy biomarkers as sort of the primary marker, whereas for top coats, we're using HDA. We are yet to look at the complex multidimensional relationships of all these classes of chemicals or this complex exposome and other endpoints. Like we know metals are involved in oxidative stress, PFAS are involved in oxidative stress in urine. But again, this initial layer of analysis establishes clearly elevated oxidative stress that is driven by chemical exposures at work. The interest in kidney toxicity emerged several years ago, largely because of 2 secondary observations. It wasn't a primary goal at that time. It has become a central interest of ours now. And the first one was our observation that urinary creatinine data were abnormal to the point that if you follow WHO guidelines, and we presented on this before, you would have to exclude 80% of all the samples we have collected in the field as having way too much creatinine in urine. The second one was we would observe that workers, some workers were experiencing an advanced level of dehydration to the point that they couldn't produce any urine. And a couple of cases we have observed in the field that they were experiencing heat stress. And so the interest was based on the literature and the observation that the kidneys, a very sensitive organ, could potentially be a target organ for all of these mixed exposures. And because we're focusing so much on urine, it makes sense to look at the kidneys first. Of the many biomarkers that are used in the literature for evaluating kidney injury, whether it's acute or chronic, we focused on this subset, which has been endorsed by a consortium on kidney injury. You could read through the slides what each one of them implies, but KIM-1 in particular and osteopontin are particularly selective and sensitive markers, cystatin C as well. And we did measure these markers in urine, both pre and post shift. Here we show cumulative distribution of KIM-1 in the group of workers. A normal healthy kidney shouldn't produce any KIM-1 or should produce very low levels, somewhere around 1 or 2, depending on what references you look at. And for our cohort, in pre-shift urine, we had about 60% of them with greater than 1 nanogram per milliliter KIM-1, and post-shift, almost everyone, 83% of them exceeded that threshold. And you could see here that, again, over 50% of workers have more than 2. Similarly, osteopontin, one reference we found is 500 to around 2,000 nanogram per milliliter. 7% exceed this 2,000 and more exceed the lower range. And we similarly, the same picture with creatinine, similar picture with cystatin C. and to some extent, similar picture with several other biomarkers. And we have more extensive biomarkers here. I'm just not presenting those. We're including total protein and albumin and pH and electrolytes and the like, all confirming a similar picture. And you could see here that in mid-coat in particular was associated with the largest changes in KIM1. Top coat, more variability and less of a jump, which is suggesting that these epoxy-based formulations may have a higher tendency to affect the kidneys. We don't know exactly which one of them, but we have a list of those chemicals that target the kidneys. You look at cross-sieve changes, and again, same picture, KIM1, osteopontin, and creatinine, and another one, I think cystatin C also are elevated and statistically significantly elevated, with coating workers having higher numbers of these biomarkers relative to SPF, which we have used as a comparative cohort. Field observations also suggested that heat stress is a realistic challenge in this cohort of workers, in part because they have to apply these formulations within certain environmental parameters, and relative humidity and temperature are specified. They use tarp enclosures, and we have sampled at times in environments where temperatures inside these enclosures have been 116 Fahrenheit or 46 Celsius that we've measured, and we have observed evidence of both heat stress and heat exhaustion. And we have a long-standing interest in the adaptation of biochemical markers to track heat-related and severity in these workers, and even more so the potential interaction between heat stress, dehydration, and chemical exposures on kidney toxicity. Again, in vein with that, very recently, this paper by Goto et al. 2022 from Japan provided compelling evidence that liver-derived fatty acid binding protein is a promising heat stress biomarker and is measured in urine. This biomarker has been used in the past to some extent for kidney injury and other sort of pathologies, but it correlates the strongest with core body temperature and the severity of heat stress in this paper. And so we used this marker as an early indicator of heat stress, and we explored both the distribution of the values of this marker and association with other kidney injury markers. On this paper, KIM1 was identified as a marker closely reflecting kidney injury and association with circulating cystatin C in the blood and severity of kidney injury, but it was correlated with L-FAB-P, but it was not seen as or endorsed as a marker of heat stress, rather a marker of kidney injury. And so for this cohort of workers, a significant change in cross-shift in several cases. And you look at cumulative distribution as a crude indicator of how extensive heat stress could be in this group of people. We used a ballpark value just as an initial sort of first order guide, and we estimated close to 25% of these samples are indicative of advanced heat stress. Again, this is very preliminary, and as you write the paper, we may refine our interpretation of data. But just as a sort of deposit in the sand. Alpha-P we found to be associated with markers of exposure in urine, badge and HDA for mid coats and top coats, and also strongly associated with 3 other markers of acute kidney injury, which is KIM1, osteopontin, and NGAL. 2 of these biomarkers point to proximal tubule injury. Other biomarkers point to other sort of regions of the kidneys. And at higher levels than in SPF workers, although a small group of workers there also indicated sort of elevated levels of some kidney injury markers. We think there has to be a special emphasis on the interplay of mixed chemical exposures, heat stress, and dehydration on kidney health in construction workers, and by extension, maybe other professionals that share similar features. And these are just some preliminary data in that context. I would like to take this opportunity to share with you an exciting opportunity for research and invite you to be part of it. We were funded 3 years to develop a national roadmap to reduce PFAS exposures in construction, where the goal is to map the use of PFAS in a broad range of construction materials, conduct biomonitoring of construction workers, and identify those with elevated PFAS levels by doing biomonitoring in plasma, urine, and stool. And we'll be using the National Academy of Sciences risk categorization scheme for guiding level of risk, as well as other emerging data on PFAS toxicology. We are in the process of reaching out to our potential partners. Why would be good for unions and construction workers to participate? Per National Academy of Sciences report, every United States citizen, or any citizen for that matter, should know their PFAS levels. Quest Diagnostics now is offering PFAS testing for a subset. I think it's 12 common PFASs, the long chain ones, the conventional ones. If you, it's a few $100s, I think, if you want to really understand PFAS levels and take measures to reduce them, there are non-pharmacological options that we and others are pursuing with promising results for reducing PFAS body burden. And so I think knowing what your PFAS levels are is a good thing to do for yourself, but also in the process of interacting with us, we will share the latest and the greatest on risk reduction, as well as options for PFAS reduction of the body burden and PFAS detoxification, although my molecular toxicologist colleagues warn me to use the word PFAS detoxification more sparingly, but I think detoxification is appropriate, and provide input on the materials to be tested. So it's an opportunity for you to be part of this research and shape a safer future for the construction industry. Now, to sum up, and we'll have at least 10 minutes of question and answers. You can read this, but in the paper we recently published in the American Journal of Industrial Medicine, we provide a context about the various opportunities and challenges that we as a community have to making this vital industry safer, while not constraining the use of materials that provide exceptional quality. We all want coatings to last 20 and 30 years. And even when I choose products, I want products that are of the highest quality. We advocate for improving the well-being and safety of these materials by tweaking the formulations so that we preserve or enhance functionality, while improving the safety profile of these chemicals. And to their credit, the manufacturing industry has continued to innovate and improve formulation of these products. Benzene used to be once a common solvent in this formulation. Benzene now is found only as a trace impurity from the supply chain. And these are innovations that we want to expand through iterative processes. We also believe that this is an industry that at least chemical exposures in construction continue to receive limited attention. A good indicator of that is you look at the number of research teams that are working on this topic, and you can count them with one finger or two. And the problems are, from a scientific standpoint, are rather complex and require more investment and more people and researchers engaged in this conversation. As we were putting together this last slide, we were looking at sort of whether anyone is doing any cancer screening for industrial painters commercially. And actually there is such a company along the lines of whole body scans and cancer screening that is happening quite commonly among the firefighters, but also excellent programs on screening and disease monitoring and prevention. Two of them that come to mind are the firefighter cancer screening program down in Miami and Arizona with Professor Burgess, as well as the World Trade Center down at Mount Sinai, if I'm not mistaken. But I think increasing awareness, working with product formulations, investing in methodologies to document and improve exposure reduction efforts are part of the suite of solutions that we need to embrace and promote. And with that, I would thank you for your attention and stop here and thank our collaborators and contractors and everyone else who has contributed in big ways and small ways to enable us to do this research. Thank you.
Thanks, Dhimiter. We do have a few questions, and if I have time, I'll go to the chat and the Q&A, but wanted to pull a couple that came in before the webinar. Number one is, when conducting exposure monitoring on workers using paint, including a mixture of chemicals, what compounds do you choose to target and why?
I think this is a fundamentally critical question. And I think it's where you start, at least where we had to start. Not all chemicals are created equal from the standpoint of their physical chemical properties and toxicology. We have prioritized 3 classes of chemicals based on endpoints: chemical sensitizers, carcinogens, and then the third category is endocrine disruptors, based on the fact that they tend to exert functions, physiological responses at low or extremely low level, and sometimes the endpoints are switch-like sensitization. Once you are sensitized, then becomes practically impossible for some of these to become desensitized. So you're sensitized and remain sensitized. So the severity of the outcome is high, and effects happen at low levels. Now, which of those chemicals within those classes do you target? Unfortunately, there's no magic button anywhere in the scientific literature. And in cases where this legwork has not been done, one has to do the legwork to look at the literature, look at the materials, look at the toxicology, and identify and target those chemicals, and then develop the method. So the amine catalysts are a good example of that. And carcinogens, another good example of that. And other chemicals in the very persistent and bioaccumulative class would fall in that category as well. Unfortunately, there is no easy answer, but there is a process. And what I showed here is one such systematic and documented and backed up process for prioritizing and making choices where to invest.
Great, thanks, Dhimiter. Next question, are there ototoxic hazards with any paints or thinners?
The short answer is yes. There is some good literature from, I think, the Scandinavian network. We identified 3 ototoxic chemicals. We have listed them on the paper. I think it's toluene, ethyl benzene, and xylene that are known ototoxic chemicals. Potentially others that we do not know, but we know that there are ototoxic chemicals in these formulations.
Thank you. The next question is, can an initial allergic reaction develop into ongoing worsening conditions such as asthma?
Yes, I think yes, whichever way you approach it. We know that, so chemicals, some chemicals are sensitizers to the skin, whether they are allergic, they cause allergic contact dermatitis, and it stops there, only with manifestation of sensitization and responses on the skin. However, isocyanates, some epoxies, and maybe other chemicals are respiratory sensitizers, and sensitization could occur both through inhalation exposure or skin exposure. And sometimes there's plenty of literature on this. Skin exposure is a more effective way of driving systemic sensitization. And then repeated exposures at very low inhalation exposures at sometimes low levels, very low levels, can trigger asthmatic attacks. I think epoxy and isocyanate-based formulations meet those criteria for having both respiratory sensitizers and asthmagens, and there's literature on that, quite a bit of it, and skin sensitizers in them.
Great, thank you. There are 2 questions I wanted to hit at that came in during the presentation. One should be just kind of a simple straight ahead, which Annie may have answered, that I can see at least, but for the PFAS in urine of construction workers, what you showed on the screen, the results,
Yeah,
was there a baseline collected prior to the start of the coating operations?
that's correct. So we collected 2 urine samples. One is at the beginning of the shift, as the workers got at the work site, before they started work. The other one was at the end of the shift, with a minimum of about 6 hours difference. So that is pre-shift baseline. That is not baseline in the sense that it doesn't reflect background exposures. It could, but we have an extensive research portfolio on PFAS, and I understand, I'm starting to read more on PFAS clearance and biokinetics. And they have, depending on what PFAS you're talking, they have a range of half-lives that goes from hours to days to years. The longer ones that take years to clear, they don't show up in urine. The smaller ones have clearance half-lives in the order of hours to days. And so in the morning of the shift, even if you sample on a Monday morning, but especially if you sample on a weekday, Wednesday through Friday, the morning urine carries quite a bit of the earlier exposure episodes. And so, and this is true for just about all the biomarkers we measured. So the pre-shift data we interpret as an indicator of prior exposures, recent prior exposures, like the last couple of days or weeks maybe, whereas the cross shift is the most immediate impact. And again, you would need to look at the specific PFAS and what the half-life for that is, in order to state to what extent the difference reflects the ongoing exposure versus past exposures. The second consideration has to do with the actual sources in the background that the PFAS we measure in urine in the morning. I think it's fair to say not all of it comes from occupational exposure. Some of them could originate from sources other than occupation. Cosmetics using Teflon coated pens, which remarkably produce quite a bit of PFAS and the like.
All right, I'm gonna wrap it up on there just to let folks know. I acknowledge there's a lot of questions about personal protective equipment and respirators. And please refer to SDSs at this point and stay tuned as the Bellows continue the research that they're really just getting started in our current cooperative agreement on PFAS as we learn more about it and can make better recommendations in the future. And with that, I'm gonna thank you, Dhimiter. Thank you, Annie. Thank you, Jessica, for today's webinar. And I wish everyone who is tuned in and asked questions the very best. We will collect your questions and share them with the Bellows and see if there's it'll help us figure out how to communicate about this in the future. Have a great afternoon, everybody.